Edward October. Ask any bold individualist and they'll tell you all you need for a perfect eggnog is to combine egg yolks, beaten until creamy, egg whites, beaten until fluffy, heavy cream, sugar, a generous portion of fresh grated nutmeg, and an even more generous portion of liquor. Most people use dark rum, I prefer bourbon. The final two ingredients are essential. Cozy seat by the fire in which to sip it, and a ghost story, told as only Octoberpod can tell it. This year, Octoberpod's Christmas gift to you is an evening of ghoul-tide classics written by two masters of supernatural literature. It drops on December 24th, Christmas Eve. Listen to it on Octoberpod AM, wherever you get podcasts, or at Octoberpod Home Video on YouTube. Unwind with us by the fire, and we guarantee it will be the crowning pleasure of your busy holiday season. After all, eggnog without a good belt of hooch is hardly eggnog, and Christmas without an Octoberpod ghost story is hardly Christmas. Octoberpod, Yuletide horror for bold individualists. Octoberpodvhs.com. The sound you hear is sunset on Christmas Day in a country cottage. This is the start of Octoberpod. The Gardener, an Octoberpod ghost story for Christmas. Written by EF Benson, narrated by Edward October. Two friends of mine, Hugh Granger and his wife Margaret, had taken for a month of Christmas holiday the house in which we were to witness such strange manifestations. And when I received an invitation from them to spend a fortnight there, I enthusiastically accepted. Well did I know that pleasant heathery countryside, and most intimate was my acquaintance with the subtle hazards of its charming golf links. Golf, I was given to understand, was to occupy the solid day for Hugh and me, so that Margaret should never be obliged to set her hand to the implements with which the game, so detestable to her, was conducted. I arrived there while yet the daylight lingered, and as my hosts were out, I took a ramble round the place. The house and garden stood on a plateau facing south. Below it were a couple of acres of pasture that sloped down to a vagrant stream crossed by a footbridge, by the side of which stood a thatched cottage with a vegetable patch surrounding it. A path ran close past this, across the pasture, from a wicket gate in the garden, conducted you over the footbridge, and so constituted a shortcut to the links that lay not half a mile beyond. The cottage itself was clearly on the land of the little estate, and I supposed it to be the gardener's house. And yet it appeared to be untenanted. No wreath of smoke, though the evening was chilly, curled from its chimneys, and, coming closer, I fancied it had that air of waiting about it. There it stood with no sign of life whatever about it, though ready, as its apparently perfect state of repair seemed to warrant, for fresh tenants to put the breath of life into it again. Its little garden, too, told the same tale. The beds were untended and unweeded, and the flower border by the front door was a row of chrysanthemums, which had withered on their stems. But all this was the impression of a moment, and I did not pause as I passed it, but crossed the footbridge and went up the heathery slope that lay beyond. I made a detour, as a golfer will, to walk up the fairway of the 17th and 18th holes, just for the pleasure of recognition, and looked respectfully at the yawning sand pit which so inexorably guards the 18th green. The light of the winter evening had faded fast, and when I crossed the footbridge on my return, the dusk had gathered. To my right, just beside the path, lay the cottage, the whitewashed walls of which gleamed in the gloaming. And as I turned my glance back from it to the rather narrow plank which bridged the stream, I thought I caught, out of the tail of my eye, some light from one of its windows, which thus disproved my theory that it was untenanted. But when I looked directly at it again, I saw that I was mistaken. Some reflection in the glass of the red lines of sunset in the west must have deceived me, for in the inclement twilight it looked more desolate than ever. Yet I lingered by the wicket gate and its low palings, For though all exterior evidence bore witness to its emptiness, some inexplicable feeling assured me, quite irrationally, that this was not so, and that there was somebody there. Certainly there was nobody visible, but it became a matter of importance in my mind to ascertain whether this was so. I went through the small garden and rapped at the door. There was no answer, and after waiting for a response to a second summons, and having tried the door and found it locked, I made the circuit of the house. Of course there was no one there, and I told myself that I was just like a man who looks under his bed for a burglar, and would be beyond measure astonished if he found one. My hosts were at the house when I arrived, and we spent a cheerful 2 hours before dinner in such eager conversation as is proper between friends who have not met for some time. Between Hugh Granger and his wife, it is always impossible to light upon a subject which does not vividly interest one or other of them, and so golf, politics, cooking, ghosts, and the income tax were among the topics which we passionately discussed. With all these plates spinning, it was easy to whip up any one of them, and the subject of spooks generally was lighted upon again and again. "Margaret is on the high road to madness," remarked Hugh on one of these occasions. "You see, she's begun using planchette. I'm told that if you use planchette for 6 months, most careful doctors will conscientiously certify you as insane. By my calculations, she's got 5 months more before she goes to Bedlam." "Oh, it says most interesting things," said Margaret. "It says things that never entered my head. We'll try it tonight." "Not tonight," said Hugh. "Let's have an evening off." Margaret disregarded this. "And it's no use asking planchette questions," she went on, "because there's in your mind some sort of answer to them. If I ask whether it will be fair tomorrow, for instance, it is probably I, though indeed I don't mean to push, who makes the pencil say yes. And then it usually rains," remarked Hugh. "Not always. Don't interrupt. The interesting thing is to let the pencil write what it chooses. And very often it only makes loops and curves, though they may mean something. And every now and then a word comes, the significance of which I have no idea whatever, so I clearly couldn't have suggested it. Yesterday evening, for instance, it wrote gardener over and over again. Now what did that mean? The gardener here is a Methodist with a chin beard. Could it have meant him? Oh, it's time to dress. Do be punctual. My cook is so sensitive about soup. By the way, I asked, what's that cottage in the field by the footbridge? Is that the gardener's cottage? It used to be, said Hugh, but the chin-beard doesn't live there. In fact, nobody lives there. It's empty. If I owned this estate, I should put the chin-beard into it and take the rent off his wages. Some people have no idea of economy. Why do you ask? I saw Margaret was looking at me rather attentively. Curiosity. Idle curiosity.
As I wander out under the sky, how Jesus, our Savior, did come for to die. For poor ornery people like you and like I wonder, as I wonder.
A gleam of strong moonlight between my drawn curtains when I went up to bed that night led me to look out. My room faced the garden and the fields which I had traversed that afternoon, and all was vividly illuminated by the full moon. The thatched cottage with its white walls close by the stream was very distinct, and once more, I suppose, the reflection of the light on the glass of one of its windows made it appear that the room was lit from within. It struck me as odd that twice that day this illusion should have been presented to me. But now a yet odder thing happened. Even as I looked, the light was extinguished. The morning did not at all bear out the fine promise of the clear night, for when I woke the wind was squealing, and sheets of rain from the southwest were dashed against my panes. Golf was wholly out of the question, and though the violence of the storm abated in the afternoon, the rain dripped with a steady sullenness. But I wearied of indoors, and since the others entirely refused to set foot outside, I went forth mackintoshed to get a breath of air. I took the road to the links in preference to the muddy shortcut through the fields, with the intention of engaging a couple of caddies for Hugh and myself next morning, and then lingered a while over illustrated papers in the smoking room. I must have read for longer than I knew, for a sudden beam of the sunset suddenly illuminated my page, and, looking up, I saw that the rain had ceased and that evening was fast coming on. So, instead of taking the long detour by the road again, I set forth homewards by the path across the fields. That gleam of sunset was the last of the day, and once again, just as 24 hours ago, I crossed the footbridge in the gloaming. Till that moment, I had not thought at all about the cottage there, but now in a flash, the light I had seen there last night, suddenly extinguished, recalled itself to my mind, and at the same moment I felt that invincible conviction that the cottage was indeed tenanted. Simultaneously, in these swift processes of thought, I looked towards it, and saw standing by the door the figure of a man. In the dusk I could distinguish nothing of his face, if indeed it was turned to me, and only got the impression of a tallish fellow, thickly built. He opened the door, from which came a dim light, as of a lamp, entered, and shut it after him. So then my conviction was right. Yet I had been distinctly told that the cottage was empty. Who then was he that entered as if returning home? Once more, this time with a certain qualm of fear, I rapped on the door, intending to put some trivial question, and rapped again, this time more drastically, so that there could be no question that my summons was unheard. But still I got no reply. And finally I tried the handle of the door. It was locked. Then, with difficulty mastering an increasing terror, I made the circuit of the cottage, peering into each unshuttered window. All was dark within, though but 2 minutes ago I had seen the gleam of light escape from the opened door. I made no allusion to my hosts of this odd adventure, and after dinner Margaret, amid protests from Hugh, got out the planchette which had persisted in writing Gardner. My surmise was, of course, utterly fantastic, but I wanted to convey no suggestion of any sort to Margaret. For a long time the pencil skated over her paper, making loops and curves and peaks like a temperature chart, and she had begun to yawn and grow weary over her experiment before any coherent word emerged. And then, in the oddest way, her head nodded forward and she seemed to have fallen asleep. She fell asleep the other night over it, Hugh said to me in a whisper. Margaret's eyes were closed, and she breathed the long, quiet breaths of slumber, and then her hand began to move with a curious firmness. Right across the big sheet of paper went a level line of writing, and at the end, her hand stopped with a jerk, and she woke. She looked at the paper and read what she had written. Gardner, it ran. I am the gardener. I want to come in. I can't find her here. Looking up from the paper, I saw Margaret's eyes fixed on me, and even before she spoke, I knew what her thought was. Did you come by the empty cottage? She asked. Yes, I said. Still empty? She said in a low voice. Or anything else? I did not want to tell her just what I had seen, or what, at any rate, I thought I had seen. I rapped at the door again, I said, and there was no answer. Presently there was a move to bed, and after she had gone upstairs, Hugh and I went to the front door to interrogate the weather. Once more the moon shone in a clear sky, and we strolled out along the flagged path that fronted the house. Suddenly, Hugh turned quickly and pointed to the angle of the house. Who on earth is that? He said. Look, there. He's gone round the corner. I had but the glimpse of a tallish man with heavy build. Didn't you see him? Asked Hugh, I'll just go round the house and find him. I don't want anyone prowling round us at night. Wait here, will you? And if he comes round the other corner, ask him what his business is." Hugh had left me in our stroll, close by the front door, which was open, and there I waited until he should have made his circuit. He had hardly disappeared when I heard, quite distinctly, a rather quick but heavy footfall coming along the paved walk towards me from the opposite direction. But there was absolutely no one to be seen who made this sound of rapid walking. Closer and closer to me came the steps of the invisible one, and then, with a shudder of horror, I felt someone unseen push by me as I stood on the threshold. That shudder was not merely of the spirit, for the touch of him was that of ice on my hand. I tried to seize this impalpable intruder, but he slipped from me, and next moment I heard his steps on the parquet of the floor inside. Some door within opened and shut, and I heard no more of him. Next moment Hugh came running round the corner of the house, from which the sound of steps had approached. "Well, where is he?" he asked. He was not 20 yards in front of me. A big, tall fellow. "I saw no one," I said. "I heard his step along the walk, but there was nothing to be seen. Whatever it was seemed to brush by me and go into the house." There had certainly been no sound of steps on the bare oak stairs, and we searched room after room through the ground floor of the house. The dining room door was locked, and the only other door which could have furnished the impression of an opening and a shutting was that into the kitchen. Here again our quest was fruitless. Through pantry and scullery and boot room, but all was empty and quiet. Finally we came to the kitchen, which too was empty, but by the hearth there was set a rocking chair, and this was oscillating to and fro as if someone, lately sitting there, had just quitted it. There it stood gently rocking, and this seemed to convey the sense of a presence, invisible now, more than even the sight of him who surely had been sitting there could have done. I remember wanting to steady it and stop it, and yet my hand refused to go forth to it. I had a broken night after that. Long I lay wide-eyed and open-eared, and when at last I dozed, I was plucked from the borderland of sleep by the sound, muffled but unmistakable, of someone moving about the house. It occurred to me that the steps might be those of Hugh conducting a lonely exploration, but even while I wondered, a tap came at the door of communication between our rooms, and in answer to my response it appeared that Hugh had come to see whether it was I thus uneasily wandering. Even as we spoke, the step passed my door, and the stairs leading to the floor above creaked to its ascent. Next moment it sounded directly above our heads, in some attics in the roof. "Those are not the servants' bedrooms," said Hugh. "No one sleeps there. Let's look once more. It must be somebody." With lit candles we made our way upstairs, and just when we were at the top of the flight, Hugh uttered a sharp exclamation. "Something's passing by me," he said, and he clutched at the empty air. Even as he spoke, I experienced the same sensation, and the moment afterwards the stairs below us creaked again as the unseen passed down. All night long that sound of steps moved about the passages, as if someone was searching the house, and as I lay awake and listened, that message, which had come through the pencil of the planchette to Margaret's fingers, occurred to me. I want to come in. I cannot find her here. The next morning, as I dressed, I found myself vainly trying to recapture the horror of the spirit which had accompanied these nocturnal adventures. I remembered that something within me had sickened as I watched the movements of the rocking chair the night before, and as I heard the steps along the paved way outside, and by that invisible pressure against me, knew that someone had entered the house. But now, in the sane and tranquil morning, and all day under the serene winter sun, I could not realize what it had been. The presence, like the bodily pain, had to be there for the realization of it, and all day it was absent. "Well, he's had a good look," Hugh said, "whoever he is, and whomever he was looking for. By the way, not a word to Margaret, please. She heard nothing of these perambulations, nor of the entry of whatever it was." Margaret had arranged to drive over to have tea with some friends of hers that afternoon, and in consequence Hugh and I refreshed ourselves at the clubhouse after our game. And it was already dusk when, for the third day in succession, I passed homewards by the whitewashed cottage. But tonight I had no sense of it being subtly occupied. It stood mournfully desolate, as is the way of untenanted houses, and no light nor semblance of such gleamed from its windows. "A psychic disturbance, old boy," Hugh said as we reached the door to the main house. "Like a cold, but in the head. Hello? The door is locked." He rang and rapped, and from inside the noise of a turned key and withdrawn bolts. "What's this door locked for?" he asked the servant who opened it. The man shifted from one foot to the other. "The bell rang half an hour ago, sir," he said, "and when I came to answer it, there was a man standing outside and—" "Well?" asked Hugh. "I didn't like the look of him, sir," he said, "and I asked him his business. He didn't say anything, and then he must have gone pretty smartly away, for I never saw him go." "Where did he seem to go?" asked Hugh, glancing at me. "I can't rightly say, sir. He didn't seem to go at all. Something seemed to brush right by me." That'll do," said Hugh rather sharply. Presently, Margaret returned from her visit with a flush of excitement on her face. "Never laugh at my planchette again," she said. "I've heard the most extraordinary story from Maud Ashfield. Horrible, but so frightfully interesting. There was once a gardener who used to live in that little cottage by the footbridge, and when the family were up in London, he and his wife used to be caretakers, and lived here." Hugh's glance and mine met. Then he turned away, and I knew that his thoughts were identical with my own. "He married a wife much younger than himself," continued Margaret, "and gradually he became frightfully jealous of her. And one day, in a fit of passion, he strangled her with his own hands. A little while after, someone came to the cottage and found him sobbing over her, trying to restore her. They went for the police, but before they came, he had cut his own throat. Isn't it positively horrible? It is rather curious that the planchette said gardener. I am the gardener. I want to come in. I can't find her here. You see, I knew nothing about it. Nothing at all. I shall do planchette again tonight. Oh, dear me. The post goes in half an hour, and I have a whole budget to send. And you respect my planchette for the future, Hughie." We talked the situation out when she had gone, but Hugh, unwillingly convinced and yet unwilling to admit that the planchette nonsense may not be nonsense, still insisted that Margaret should be told nothing of what we had heard and seen in the house that night. "She'll be frightened," he said, "and she'll begin imagining things. As for the planchette, as likely as not it will do nothing but scribble and make loops." "What's that?" There had come from somewhere in the room one sharp, peremptory rap. I do not think it came from the door, but Hugh, when no response replied to his words of admittance, jumped up and opened it. He took a few steps into the hall outside and returned. "No one there," he said. "Not a soul." Hugh came back to the fireplace and rather irritably threw a cigarette which he had just lit into the fender. "We've got to keep a hand on ourselves," he said. There is nothing so infectious as fear, and Margaret mustn't catch it from us. But there's something more than our fear. Something has got into the house, and we're up against it. If you want to know what I think it is, said I believe it to be the spirit of the man who strangled his wife and then cut his throat. But I don't see how it can hurt us. We're afraid of our own fear, really. But we're up against it, said Hugh. And what will it do? Good Lord, if I only knew what it would do, I shouldn't mind. It's the not knowing. Well, it's time to dress. Margaret was in her highest spirits at dinner, knowing nothing of the manifestations of that presence which had taken place in the last 24 hours. She thought it absorbingly interesting that her planchette should have guessed about the gardener, and from that topic she flitted to the topic of a form of rummy for 3, which her friend had showed her, promising to initiate us into it after dinner. This she did, and, not knowing that we, above all things, wanted to keep planchette at a distance, she was delighted with the success of her game. But suddenly she observed that the evening was rapidly burning away, and swept the cards together at the conclusion of a hand. Now, just half an hour of planchette, she said. Margaret had already got out her machine and a sheet of paper when Hugh rose. Please, don't do it tonight, Margaret, he said. Hughie, you've got something on your mind, she said. Out with it. I could see Hugh debating in his mind as to whether to tell her or not, and I gathered that he chose the chance of her planchette inanely scribbling. Go on, then, he said. Margaret hesitated. She clearly did not want to vex Hugh. Well, just 10 minutes, she said, and I promise not to think of gardeners. She had hardly laid her hand on the board when her head fell forward, and the machine began moving. I was sitting close to her, and as it rolled steadily along the paper, the writing became visible. I have come in, it ran. But still I cannot find her. Are you hiding her? I will search the room where you are. At that moment, a current of icy air swept round the room, and at the door, this time unmistakably, came a loud, peremptory knock. Hugh sprang to his feet. Margaret, wake up, he said. Something is coming. The door opened, and there moved in the figure of a man. He stood just within the door, his head bent forward, and he turned it from side to side, peering, it would seem, with eyes staring and infinitely sad into every corner of the room. The ghost was now looking directly at Margaret. Once the lips above the thick, rust-colored beard moved, but no sound came forth. The mouth only moved and slavered. He raised his head, and I saw that one side of his neck was laid open in a red, glistening gash. For how long that pause continued when we all 3 stood stiff and frozen in some deadly inhibition to move or speak, I have no idea. I suppose that at the utmost it was a dozen seconds. Then the spectre turned and went out as it had come. We heard his steps pass along the parquet floor. There was the sound of bolts withdrawn from the front door, and with a crash that shook the house, it slammed to. The remainder of our Christmas holiday passed without incident, and though Margaret posited many wild suppositions about the ghostly presence, we spoke little more of the visitation. The weather took a beastly turn, and our subsequent sessions on the links were fleeting. The next year, I Christmased in St. Moritz with my friend Roderick. The slopes were treacherous, Our lodgings were cramped and drafty. The hotel dining room was plagued by the worst species of tourist. The food was bad, and the waiters were rude. I wouldn't have had it any other way. You have been listening to The Gardener by EF Benson, an Octoberpod ghost story for Christmas, narrated by Edward October. Monsters do have their place. In the zoo, in your nightmares, in the deep, in your favorite horror movies, but not on your phone during an ad break. Politically motivated interests are seeking to influence you through the ads placed on this podcast. Hi, I'm your host, Edward October, reminding you that we have very limited control over the ads you hear on Octoberpod. Please remember that only the ads and promos I read with my own voice carry the endorsement of Edward October and Octoberpod. Furthermore, I and the makers of Octoberpod repudiate any entity advertised which seeks to promote hatred, anti-American or anti-democratic sentiments, or the spread of misinformation. Now, with that in mind, Octoberpod will return after this brief ad break. Between the acts of Octoberpod, this is your host, Edward October. I'm sure all of you listening to this have your favorite horror and horror-adjacent films to revisit during the holiday season. Pictures like Black Christmas, rare exports, Silent Night, Deadly Night, the Krampus films, and the like. But what if I told you there was a bottomless stocking full of holiday horrors, mysteries, and dark fantasies to be found among old-time radio shows? As a special gift to you, I've compiled a nice list of naughty horror and horror-adjacent radio plays for your holiday playlist. The Signalman. Before it was a beloved BBC ghost story for Christmas, starring Denham Elliott, Charles Dickens' tale of an ominous railway spectre was a chiller frequently adapted for old-time radio. Lights Out, Beyond Midnight, Nightfall, and Suspense all adapted it at least once. Suspense, radio's outstanding theater of thrills, did two adaptations that I admire. The first starred Agnes Moorehead, then known as the First Lady of Suspense, now best remembered as Endora from Bewitched, and Joseph Kearns. The second, starring Ellen Drew and perennial Disney voice actor Ben Wright.
Why does the train frighten you so?
Now, wouldn't you think I might outgrow that silly, childish fear? If I was drawn here, as you say, I guess it was to see whether I had. The modern psychiatrist would say it was a desire to relive a childhood experience.
Oh, yes, miss, there are many answers. Yeah, philosophers have even speculated on the possibility that the future can intrude on the memory as well as the past.
Surely you don't believe that.
I believe only in the evidence of my five senses.
Both adaptations give the story a psychological element missing from Dickens' original text. It was also Octoberpod's first ghost story for Christmas. Stay tuned to hear our retelling of it. The Track of the Cat. Speaking of suspense, another episode of note is The Track of the Cat. It's part Western, part psychological thriller, and part survival horror. It deals with an insufferable rancher, played by Richard Widmark, who, according to everyone he worked with at Hammer Films, was also an insufferable bastard in real life, who goes out into a blizzard to kill the Black Panther who's been killing all his cattle.
You see, it's this way, little lady. According to Joe Sam, there's a Black Panther roams this part of the country, comes with the first snow every year. And he's big as a horse, and eyes like coals of fire. And you can see right through him. And you can shoot right through him, too. And still he'll keep coming until he gets you, because he can't never die. He's a spook.
Is the Black Panther real? Is it a revenant of Native American folklore? Or is it all just a paranoid delusion? This one is chillingly atmospheric, the perfect tale for a snowy night in the bleak midwinter. The Undead. This episode of Inner Sanctum Mysteries doesn't have much to do with Christmas, but it was broadcast during December. It was sponsored by Lipton Tea, and, amusingly, Mary, the show's Lipton Tea spokeswoman, keeps assuring the audience during commercial breaks that next week's broadcast, airing on Christmas Eve, will not be a horror story, but rather a heartwarming family holiday drama called The Littlest Angel.
Next Tuesday's Christmas, you know. So instead of our usual mystery thriller, Inner Sanctum will bring you a tender and beautiful Christmas play called The Littlest Angel. I promise you, The Littlest Angel, starring Helen Hayes, and brought to you by the makers of Lipton Tea and Lipton Soup, will be the crowning pleasure of your Christmas day.
That sounds great, Mary. Next week, we'll bring you Inner Sanctum's special Christmas program. There'll be no gore, no chill. Not even one little murder, believe it or not. The holiday spirit is getting even us. So be sure to join us next Tuesday. Meanwhile, I'm going to do my Christmas shopping. You know where I can get a nice fur-lined coffin for a cold-blooded friend?
The main story of this episode is a windswept tale of a woman who believes she may be turning into a vampire. It's goofy, cheesy, and spooky in all the right proportions. The Man Who Murdered Time. How about something for a not-so-happy new year? If you were scanning the radio dial for chills in the 1930s through 50s, The Shadow was usually a safe bet. This New Year's Eve set episode pits Lamont Cranston, the amateur criminologist who, as the Shadow, clouds men's minds so that they cannot see him, against a lunatic in control of a machine that can rewind and replay time. Yes, it's a creepy time loop story that predates both Groundhog's Day and the Star Trek The Next Generation episode Cause and Effect by decades.
Dear me, how very, very sad. All you can do is look at the antidote while you die in agony.
Please, will it help me? Help me! I don't want to die!
Just a little while now, cousin, a little while. It's almost midnight. You'll die just before midnight, and then I'll turn on my machine. Set it to affect the whole world forever, and time all over the world will snap back 24 hours. Everybody in the world will live December 31st over again and again, forever and ever. You too, you.
No.
You'll visit me again. Drink the poison cherry again, die again, live again, die again.
It starred Agnes Moorehead as Lamont Cranston's constant friend and companion Margot Lane, and Bill Johnstone in the role of Lamont Cranston and his alter ego, The Shadow. A role originated on radio by the director-star of the final radio play on our list. A Christmas Carol. Oh, you don't think Charles Dickens' immortal holiday classic is scary? Even though it is, perhaps, the ultimate ghost story for Christmas? Maybe you just haven't heard it on radio. The story of Ebenezer Scrooge has been told, retold, and reimagined countless times on film and on TV. The same was true on radio. Orson Welles and his Mercury Theatre Campbell Playhouse Company had a tradition of performing A Christmas Carol every year on radio, with Lionel Barrymore in the role of Scrooge. But my favorite performance of it happened in 1938, when Barrymore was unable to be there, and so was replaced by Orson Welles himself. Welles, who would have been only about 23 at the time, is horribly miscast as Scrooge. He plays him with a grating, old crone voice that is neither endearing nor nuanced. But it is kind of fun to hear him chewing the scenery with such obscene glee. No, this performance really shines when Welles narrates in his natural, commanding, godlike speaking voice. This is when we get to hear large swaths of Dickens' prose, when, accompanied by live sound effects and an eerie score by legendary composer Bernard Herrmann, we hear this classic band of Christmas ghosts at their most bone-chilling.
Scrooge got up and walked away from the fire. As he turned, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the corner of the room. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing, slowly at first, face. The same face he had seen in the fire, Marley's face. And Marley's body coming straight at him through the door. A body pale as the bluish smoke that comes out of a chimney on a cold day. A body so transparent that Scrooge, looking through his waistcoat, could see his watch in his waistcoat pocket. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail. And it was made of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, and heavy purses wrought in steel. Even now, Scrooge would not believe his eyes. The ghost advanced towards him.
The Visitation by Marley is atmospheric nightmare fuel, and the scenes with the charwoman picking through a dead Scrooge's belongings is suitably grotesque. I could go on and on about spooky radio shows, but I suspect the ghosts are getting restless. Another of Octoberpod's ghost stories from Christmases past begins now. Oh, whistle, and I'll come to you, my lad. Written by Montague R. James. Narrated by Edward October. You, remember our friend, Professor Parkins, don't you? Back then he was young, neat, and precise in his manner of speaking. He ventured off to the East Coast to take up golf for his winter holiday. A week or 10 days to improve his game, so he said. One of his colleagues at St. James College, an antiquarian who wanted to plan a dig in the summer, asked him to look at the site of the Templars' preceptory while he was there. The antiquarian told Parkins that the site must be quite close to the beach, about 3/4 of a mile from the Globe Inn, where Parkins would be staying. Parkins couldn't get in anywhere else. Most of the lodging houses were shut up for the winter, it seems. And the only room of any size he could have was a double-bedded one. Professor Parkins insisted on having a fairly large room, for he was taking some books down and meant to do a bit of work. And though he didn't quite fancy having an empty bed, he supposed he could manage it during such a brief stay. Besides, whenever he wasn't writing, Parkins intended to spend his time on the links. I always felt that Parkins was something of an old woman. Rather, hen-like, perhaps, in his little ways. Totally destitute, alas, of the sense of humor, but at the same time dauntless and sincere in his convictions. Well, you've met him. You remember what he was like. Professor Parkins was made welcome at the Globe Inn, was safely installed in the large double-bedded room, and was able, before retiring to rest, to arrange his materials for work upon a commodious table which occupied the outer end of the room, and was surrounded on all 3 sides by windows looking out seaward. That is to say, the central window looked straight out to sea, and those on the left and right commanded prospects along the shore to the north and south, respectively. On the south, one saw the village. On the north, no houses were visible, only the beach and the low cliff backing it. Immediately in front was a strip, not considerable, of rough grass, dotted with old anchors, capstans, and so forth. Then a broad path, then the beach. Whatever might have been the original distance between the Globe Inn and the sea, not more than 60 yards now separated them. Parkins, being above all plucky, spent the greater part of his first day in what he had called improving his game, in company with another guest at the Globe, Colonel Wilson. During the afternoon, I assume due to his poor performance on the links, the colonel's demeanor assumed a coloring so lurid that even Parkins jibbed at the thought of walking home with him. He determined, after a short and furtive look at the Colonel's bristling mustache, that it would be wiser to allow the influences of tea and tobacco to do what they could with the Colonel before the two would inevitably meet again at the dinner hour. And so he walked alone back to the Globe along the beach. In picking his way from the links to the shingle beach, his foot caught, partly in a gorse root and partly in a biggish stone, and over he went. When he got up and surveyed his surroundings, he found himself in a patch of broken ground covered with small depressions and mounds. He must be on the site of the preceptory he had promised to look at. He remembered that the Templars, to whom this site had belonged, were in the habit of building round churches, and he thought a series of mounds near him to be arranged in a circular form. Few people can resist the temptation to try their hands at a little amateur research. Our professor, however, was simply eager to oblige his colleague. He paced the circular area he had noticed and wrote down its rough dimensions in a pocket notebook. Then he proceeded to examine an oblong shape which lay east of the center of the circle, apparently at the base of a platform or altar. At one end of it, the northern, a patch of the turf was gone, removed by some boy or other creature. He decided to probe the soil here for evidences of masonry, and he took out his knife and began scraping away at the earth. Now followed another discovery. His scraping revealed a small cavity. He lighted one match after another so that he might see better, but the wind was too strong for them all. By tapping and scratching the sides with his knife, however, he was able to make out that it must be an artificial hole in the masonry. It was rectangular, and the sides were smooth and regular. As he withdrew the knife, he heard a metallic clink, and when he introduced his hand, it met with a cylindrical object lying on the floor of the hole. Naturally, he picked it up, and when he brought it into the fading daylight, he could see that it was a metal tube, about 4 inches long, and of some considerable age. It had become too late and too dark for him to think of undertaking any further research. This adventure had proved so interesting that he promised to devote more of the daylight on the morrow to archaeology. The object, which he now had safe in his pocket, was bound to be of some slight value at least. Bleak and solemn was his last view of the site before starting homeward. A faint yellow light in the west showed the golf links, on which a few figures moving towards the clubhouse were still visible. The squat Martello Tower, the lights of the village, a pale ribbon of sand, dim and murmuring sea. The wind was bitter from the north, but was at his back when he set out for the Globe. The going was both good and quiet. Before bed that night, he turned the little object over by the light of his candles. It was of bronze, he now saw, and was shaped very much after the manner of the modern dog whistle. In fact, it was a whistle. He put it to his lips, but it was quite full of caked-up sand or earth, which would not yield to knocking, but must be loosened with a knife. Tidy as ever in his habits, Parkins cleared out the earth onto a piece of paper and took the latter to the window to empty it out. The night was clear and bright, as he saw when he had opened the casement, and he stopped for an instant to look out at the sea and note a belated wanderer standing on the shore, just in front of the inn. Then he shut the window, a little surprised at the late hours people kept, and took his whistle to the light again. Why, surely there were marks on it, and not merely marks, but letters. A very little rubbing rendered the deeply cut inscription quite legible, and the professor had to confess, after some earnest thought, that the meaning of it was obscure to him. There were legends both on the front and on the back of the whistle, which he utilized to decipher the inscription. He supposed himself to be a bit rusty in his Latin, unable to recall even the word for a whistle. Still, he translated part of the inscription easily enough. "Who is this who is coming?" He laughed to himself. Evidently, the best way to find out is to whistle. He blew upon the whistle tentatively and stopped suddenly, startled and yet pleased at the note he had elicited. It had a quality of infinite distance in it, and, soft as it was, he somehow felt it must be audible for miles round. It was a sound, too, that seemed to have the power of forming pictures in the brain. He saw quite clearly for a moment a vision of a wide, dark expanse at night, with a fresh wind blowing, and in the midst of that, a lonely figure. Just then a gust of wind surged against his casement, so sudden that it made him look up, just in time to see the white glint of a seabird's wing somewhere outside. Parkins could not help trying to whistle once more, this time more boldly, and then another gust of wind, this time strong enough to force open the window and blow out all the candles in the room. The first thing was to get the window shut. Parkins was struggling with the small casement and felt almost as if he were pushing back a stout burglar. The gust slackened all at once, and the window banged to and latched itself. Still the wind went on, moaning and rushing past the house, at times rising to a cry so desolate that Parkins thought he might be happier without it. Whether it was the wind or the excitement of golf or the researches in the preceptory that kept Parkins awake, he was not sure. Awake he remained, in any case, long enough to fancy, as I'm afraid I often do myself, that he was the victim of all manner of fatal disorders. He would lie counting the beats of his heart, convinced that it was going to stop work every moment, and would entertain grave suspicions of his lungs, brain, liver, etc. Parkins shut his eyes and determined to give sleep every chance. Here again, overexcitement exerted itself in another form, that of making pictures in his mind. His experience on this occasion was a very distressing one. What he saw was this: a long stretch of shore, a scene very much like that of his afternoon's walk. The light was obscure, conveying an impression of a gathering storm, of a late winter evening, and slight cold rain. In the distance, a bobbing black object appeared. A moment more, and it was a man running, jumping, clambering over the dunes, and every few seconds looking eagerly back. The nearer he came, the more obvious it was that he was terribly frightened. Though the features of his face were unclear, he was almost at the end of his strength. Now there began to be seen, far up the shore, a little flicker of something light-colored, moving to and fro with great swiftness and irregularity, rapidly looking up in an attitude of painful anxiety. Growing larger, it too declared itself as a figure in pale, fluttering draperies, ill-defined. There was something about its motion which made Parkins very unwilling to see it at close quarters. It would stop, raise its arms, bow itself towards the sand, then run stooping across the beach to the water edge and back again, and then, rising upright once more, continue its course forward at a speed that was startling and terrifying. At last it came to a stop, stood upright, with arms raised high, and then darted straight forward. At this point, Parkins opened his eyes. With many misgivings, he finally resigned himself to light his candle, get out a book, and pass the night waking, rather than to be tormented by this persistent panorama, which he saw could only be a morbid reflection of his walk and his thoughts on that very day. The scraping of match on box and the glare of light must have startled some creatures of the night, rats or whatnot, which he heard scurry across the floor from the side of his bed with much rustling. The first match went out almost instantly, but the second one burnt better, and a candle and book were duly procured, over which Parkins pored till sleep of a wholesome kind came upon him. For about the first time in his orderly and prudent life, he forgot to blow out the candle, and when he was called next morning at 8, there was still a flicker in the socket and a sad mess of guttered grease on the top of the little table. After breakfast, he was in his room, putting the finishing touches on his golfing costume, when one of the maids came in. She asked whether he'd like extra blankets on his bed. Yes, it seems like to turn rather colder. Which bed should it be put on? Why, the one I slept in. Begging your pardon, but you seem to sleep in both. Leastways, we had to make them both up this morning. Dear me, said Parkins. I may have disordered the room more than I thought when I was unpacking my things. He then set forth determined to improve his game. On the links, Parkins found the colonel quite chatty as the morning advanced. Their discourse turned to the subject of the strong gusts of wind the night before. In my old home, we should have said someone, some dark and unsavory stranger, no doubt, had been whistling for the wind. Summoning it, if you like, said the colonel. Should you indeed? Parkins inquired about local superstitions concerning the wind in the colonel's part of the country. I don't know about superstition, said the colonel. They believe in it all over Denmark and Norway, as well as on the Yorkshire coast. Parkins said that, for his part, he was a convinced disbeliever in the supernatural. No belief in second sight, ghosts, or anything of the kind? No, and nothing whatever of that kind. Now, as to whistling for the wind, Parkins said, let me give you my theory about it. The laws which govern wind are really not at all perfectly known. To fisher folk and such, of course, not known at all. A man or woman of eccentric habits, perhaps, or a stranger, is seen repeatedly on the beach at some unusual hour, and is heard whistling. Soon afterwards, a violent wind rises. A man who could read the sky perfectly, or who possessed a barometer, could have foretold that it would. The simple people of a fishing village have no barometers, and only a few rough rules for prophesying weather. What could be more natural, then, than assuming some eccentric stranger had raised the wind? Now, take last night's wind. As it happens, I myself was whistling. I blew a whistle twice, and the wind seemed to come absolutely in answer to my call. Then Parkins related to the colonel the story of the whistle, and how he had come to discover it, and the two got on well enough for the duration of the day, not parting until light began to fail them. Only then did Parkins remember that he had meant to do some more investigating at the preceptory. But it was of no great importance, he reflected. One day was as good as another. He might as well go home with the colonel. As they turned the corner of the inn, the colonel was almost knocked down by a boy, who rushed into him at top speed, and then, instead of running away, remained hanging on to him and panting. When the boy got his breath, he began to howl, and still he clung to the colonel's legs. Once he'd quite pulled himself together, the boy said he had been playing about on the grass in front of the globe when he happened to look up at the front window and see it waving at him. It seemed to be a figure of some sort, in white as far as he knew. Couldn't see its face, but it waved at him, and it weren't a right thing, not to say a right person. Was there a light in the room? No. Which was the window? Was it the top one or the second one? The second one it was. The big window, what's got the two little ones at the side. Parkins' room. The boy ran along to his tea, and Parkins and the colonel returned to the globe. They were soon in the passage, and Parkins opened the door. A quick inspection found that nothing seemed to have been noticeably disturbed. "This is more serious than I thought," said Parkins. "Now," he went on, "if the servants are in the habit of going into one's room during the day when one is away, I can only say that I don't approve of it at all." He busied himself in opening the door, which was indeed locked, and in lighting candles. "No," he said, "nothing seems disturbed." "Except your bed," put in the colonel. "Excuse me, that isn't my bed," said Parkins. "I don't use that one. But it does look as if someone had been playing tricks with it." It certainly did. The clothes were bundled up and twisted together in a most torturous confusion. Parkins pondered. They rang for the maid, who, to make a long story short, deposed that she had made the bed in the morning when the gentleman was in the room, and hadn't been back since. No, she hadn't had any other key. No one did, aside from the hotel manager. This was a puzzle. Had the staff of the hotel been playing tricks on him? No. Parkins, fair-minded as he was, could detect nothing which pointed to the guilt of anyone employed by the Globe. He was much more inclined to think that the boy had been imposing on the colonel. The matter was dropped, and the two men parted for the night.
Oh, come thou day spring, come and cheer our spirits by thine advent here. Disperse the gloomy...
By some unfortunate accident, there were neither blinds nor curtains to the windows of the professor's room. The previous night, he had thought little of this, but tonight there seemed every prospect of a bright moon rising to shine directly on his bed, and probably wake him later on. When he noticed this, Parkins was a good deal annoyed, but he succeeded in rigging up, with the help of a railway rug, some safety pins, and a stick and umbrella, a screen which, if it only held together, would keep the moonlight off his bed, and shortly afterwards he was comfortably in that bed. He must have slept soundly for an hour or more, when a sudden clatter shook him up in a most unwelcome manner. In a moment he realized what had happened. His carefully constructed screen had given way, and a very bright frosty moon was shining directly on his face. This was highly annoying. Could he possibly get up and reconstruct the screen? Could he even manage to sleep if he did not? There had been a movement, he was sure, in the empty bed on the opposite side of the room. Tomorrow he would have it moved, and there must be rats or something playing about in it. It was quiet now. No, the commotion began again, and there was a rustling and shaking, surely more than any rat could manage. I can figure to myself something of the professor's bewilderment and horror, for I have, in a dream, 30 years back, seen the same thing happen. But you will hardly perhaps imagine how dreadful it was to him to see a figure suddenly sit up in what he had known was an empty bed. Parkins was out of his own bed in one bound, and dashed towards the window, where lay his only weapon, the stick with which he had propped his screen. This was, as it turned out, the worst thing he could have done, because the personage in the empty bed, with a sudden, smooth motion, slipped from the bed and took up a position with outspread arms between the two beds and in front of the door. Parkins watched it in a horrid perplexity. Somehow the idea of getting past it and escaping through the door was intolerable to him. He could not have borne, he did not know why, to touch it. And as for its touching him, he would sooner go crashing through the window than have that happen. It stood for the moment in a band of dark shadow, and he had not seen what its face was like. Now it began to move in a stooping posture, and all at once the spectator realized, with some horror and some relief, that it must be blind. For it seemed to feel about with its muffled arms in a groping and random fashion. Turning half away from him, it became suddenly conscious of the bed he had just left, and darted towards it, and bent and felt over the pillows in a way which made Parkins shudder, as he had never in his life thought it possible. Then, moving forward into a shaft of light, and facing the window, it showed for the first time what manner of thing it was. Parkins, who very much dislikes being questioned about it, did once describe something of it in my hearing, and I gathered that what he chiefly remembers about it is a horrible, intensely horrible, face of crumpled linen. What expression he read upon it he could not or would not tell, but that the fear of it went nigh to maddening him is certain. It leapt towards him upon the instant. As it groped and waved, one corner of its draperies swept across Parkins' face. He could not keep back a cry of disgust, and the next moment he was halfway through the window, backwards, uttering cry upon cry at the utmost pitch of his voice, and the linen face was thrust close to his own. At this, deliverance came, as you will have guessed. The colonel burst the door open, and was just in time to see the dreadful tableau at the window. When he reached the figures, only one was left. Parkins sank forward into the room in a faint, and before him on the floor lay a tumbled heap of bedclothes. Colonel Wilson asked no questions, but busied himself keeping everyone else out of the room, and in getting Parkins back to bed. The colonel wrapped himself in a rug and occupied the other bed for the rest of the night. The next morning, the colonel left the hotel door, carrying a small object between his finger and thumb, which he cast as far into the sea as his very brawny arm could send it. There's really nothing more to tell, but as you may imagine, the professor's views on certain points are less clear-cut than they used to be. His nerves, too, have suffered. He cannot bear the sight of a robe or a coat hanging on a door quite unmoved, and the spectacle of a scarecrow in a field, late on a winter afternoon, has cost him more than one sleepless night. If the story you just heard unsettled you, don't worry. All that means is that you're still sane. Let's hope your grip on sanity holds after you listen to our next story, which begins after this soothing commercial break. The Signalman by Charles Dickens, narrated by Edward October. "Hello! Below there!" When he heard my voice, he was standing at the door of his box, with a flag in his hand, furled round its short pole. Instead of looking up to where I stood on the top of the steep cutting, nearly over his head, he turned about and looked down the line. "Hello! Hello! Below!" Then he turned again and, raising his eyes, saw my figure high above him. "Is there a path by which I may come down?" He looked up at me without replying. Just then there came a vague vibration in the earth and air, quickly changing into a violent pulsation, and an oncoming rush that caused me to start back, as though it had force to draw me down. I looked down again and saw him refurling the flag he had shown while the train went by. He motioned with his rolled-up flag towards a point on my level. There, I found a rough zigzagging path notched out. The cutting was deep through a clammy stone that became oozier and wetter as I went down. When I reached the little man, I saw that he was standing as though he were waiting for me to appear. He was dark and sallow. His post was in as solitary and dismal a place as ever I saw. On either side, a dripping wet wall of jagged stone excluded all view but a strip of sky. The view on one side, a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon. On the other side, the gloomy entrance to the black, forbidding tunnel, marked by an eerie red light that scarcely pierced its murky depths. So little sunlight ever found its way to this spot that it had an earthy, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck chill to me, as if I had left the natural world. "This was a lonesome post to occupy," I said, "and it had riveted my attention when I looked down from up yonder. A visitor must be a rarity, though not an unwelcome rarity, I hoped." He directed a most unusual look towards the red light near the tunnel's mouth, and looked about it, as if something were missing from it, and then looked at me. "That light was part of his charge, was it not? Don't you know it is? You look at me as though you had a dread of me, sir. I was doubtful whether I had seen you before." "Where?" He pointed to the red light. "My good fellow, what should I do there? I never was there, you may swear." "Yes, I think I may." His manner cleared, like my own. He replied to my remarks with precision. Had he much to do there? Yes, to change the signal, to trim those lights, and to turn this iron handle now and then, was all he had to do. Regarding those many long and lonely hours of which I seemed to make so much, he said that he had grown used to such a routine. He had taught himself a language down here, and had also worked at fractions and decimals, and a little algebra, but he confessed to be a poor hand at figures. Was it necessary for him, when on duty, always to remain in that channel of damp air? And could he never rise into the sunshine from between those high stone walls? Under some conditions there would be less upon the line than under others, and the same held good as to certain hours of the day and night. In bright weather, he did choose occasions for getting out of these shadows, but he was at all times liable to be called by his electric bell, and listening for it redoubled his anxiety. Thus the relief was less than I would suppose. He took me into his box, where there was a fire, a desk for an official record, a telegraphic instrument, and the little bell of which he had spoken. He was several times during our conversations interrupted by the little bell, and had to read off messages and send replies. Once he had to stand without the door and display a flag as a train passed. In the discharge of his duties, I observed him to be exact and vigilant, breaking off his course at a syllable, and remaining silent until his task was done. I should have set this man down as one of the safest of men to be employed in that capacity, but for the occasions while he was speaking that he twice broke off with fallen color, turned towards the little bell when it did not ring, opened the door of the hut, and looked towards the red light near the mouth of the tunnel. On both occasions he came back to the fire with an inexplicable air upon him. "What is your trouble?" "It is very difficult to impart, sir. It is very, very difficult to speak of." "Let me ask you a question. What made you cry, 'Hello, below there,' tonight?" "Heavens knows, I cried something to that effect." "Not to that effect, sir. Those very words. I know them well." "As you wish, those were my very words. I spoke them because I saw you below." "It was for no other reason, then?" "What other reason could I possibly have?" "You had no feeling that they were conveyed to you in any supernatural way?" "No." He bent forward as he spoke. "I took you for someone else earlier." "That troubles me." "That mistake?" "No. That's someone else." "Who is it?" "I don't know. I never saw the face. The left arm is across the face, and the right arm is violently waved, like this." He gesticulated his arm with the utmost passion and vehemence. "For God's sake, clear the way." "One moonlight night I heard a voice cry, 'Hello, below there.' I looked from that door and saw someone else standing by the red light near the tunnel, waving as I showed you. It cried, 'Look out! Look out! Hello! Below there! Look out!' I turned my lamp on red and ran towards the figure, calling, 'What has happened? Where?' It stood just outside the blackness of the tunnel, keeping the sleeve across its eyes. I ran right up at it, and had my hand stretched out to pull the sleeve away when it was gone." "Gone into the tunnel?" "No, I ran into the tunnel 500 yards. I stopped and held my lamp above my head, and saw only the wet stains stealing down the walls and trickling through the arch. I ran out again, faster this time, for I had a dread of the place upon me, and I looked all around the red light. I went up the iron ladder to the gallery atop it, and I came back down again to telegraph both ways. 'An alarm has been given. Is anything wrong?' The answer came back both ways. 'All well.' I then replied that this figure must be a deception of his sense of sight. As to an imaginary cry, do but listen for a moment to the wind in this unnatural valley, and to the wild harp it makes of the telegraph wires." He shook his head and slowly, touching my arm, "Within 6 hours after the appearance, a terrible accident on this line happened. You may have read about it. And within 10 hours the dead and wounded were brought along through the tunnel over the spot where the figure had stood." A shudder crept over me. I cannot deny the remarkable coincidence, one that must prey upon your imagination. He glanced over his shoulder with hollow eyes. "This was just a year ago. Some months passed, and I had recovered from the shock. Then one morning, at daybreak, I looked towards the red light and saw the spectre again." "Did it cry out?" "No, it was silent. It leaned against the shaft of the light, and both hands before the face, like this." He mimicked an attitude of mourning, as one might see in stone figures on tombs. "Did you go up to it?" "I came in and I sat down to collect my thoughts and my composure. When I went to the door again, daylight was above me and the ghost was gone." "But nothing followed? Nothing came of this?" He touched my arm with forefinger twice or thrice, giving a ghastly nod each time. "That very day, as a train came out of the tunnel, I noticed, at a carriage window on my side, a confusion of hands and heads, and something waved. I saw it just in time to signal the driver to stop. He shut off and put his brake on. I ran after it and heard terrible screams and cries from inside the carriage. A beautiful young lady had died instantaneously in one of the compartments. She was brought in here and laid down on this floor between us. I pushed my chair back with a start as I looked from the boards at which he pointed. True, sir, true. Precisely as it happened. He resumed. Now, sir, mark this, and judge how my mind is troubled. The spectre came back a week ago. Ever since it has been there, now and again, by fits and starts at the danger light. What does it seem to do? He repeated that former violent gesticulation of, "For God's sake, clear the way." Then, he went on, I have no peace or rest of it. It calls to me in an agonized manner, "Below there, look out, look out." Its hands waving to me. It rings my little bell. Did it ring for you yesterday evening when I was here, and you went to the door? Twice. See how your imagination misleads you. My eyes were on the bell, and my ears were open to its ring, and I assure you it did not ring at those times, nor at any other time, except when it was rung by the station communicating with you. I have never made a mistake like that, sir. Not yet. I have never confused the spectre's ring with the man's. The ghost's ring is a strange vibration in the bell that rings but produces no visible stirring. I don't wonder that you failed to hear it, yet I heard it. And did the spectre seem to be there when you looked out? It was there, both times. Will you come to the door with me now and look for it? He bit his underlip, as though he were somewhat unwilling, but arose. I opened the door while he stood in the doorway. There was the danger light. There was the dismal mouth of the tunnel. There were the high, wet stone walls of the cutting. There were the stars above them. Do you see it? No. We went in again and resumed our seats. Now you will fully understand, sir, that what troubles me so dreadfully is the question, what does the spectre mean? He said, ruminating with his eyes on the fire. What is the danger? Where? There is danger somewhere on the line, some dreadful calamity. It is not to be doubted this third time, after what has gone before. But what can I do? If I telegraph danger on either side of me, or on both, I can give no reason for it. They would think I was mad. This is the way it would work. Message, danger, take care. Answer, what danger? Where? Message, don't know, but for God's sakes, take care. They would displace me, and who could blame them? When it first stood under the danger light, why not tell me where that accident was to happen? If it must happen, why not tell me it could be averted? If it could have been averted, when on its second coming it hit its face, why not give a more explicit message of warning? If it came twice only to show me that its warnings were true, why not warn me plainly now? Why not go to someone with credit to be believed and power to act, rather than a mere poor signalman? When I saw him in this state, I saw that for his sake, as well as for the public safety, what I must now do was to compose his mind. Therefore, setting aside all question of reality or unreality between us, I represented to him that whoever thoroughly discharged his duty must do well, and that at least it was his comfort that he understood his duty, though he did not understand those confounding appearances. In this effort I succeeded. He became calm, and I left him at 2 a.m. I had offered to stay through the night, but he would not hear of it. I ultimately resolved to offer to accompany him, otherwise keeping his secret for the present, to the wisest medical practitioner we could hear of in these parts, and to take his opinion. A change in his time of duty would come round next night, he had apprised me, and he would be off an hour or two after sunrise, and on again soon after sunset. I had appointed to return accordingly. next evening was a lovely one, and I walked out early to enjoy it. The sun was not yet quite down when I traversed the field path near the top of the deep cutting. I would extend my walk, I said to myself, until time to go to the signalman's box. Before my stroll, I stepped to the brink and mechanically looked down from the point from which I had first seen him. I cannot describe the thrill when, close at the mouth of the tunnel, I saw the appearance of a man with his left sleeve across his eyes, passionately waving his right arm. The nameless horror that oppressed me suddenly seized hold of me, for I then saw that this appearance of a man was a man indeed, and that there was a group of other men standing about, to whom he seemed to be rehearsing the gesture he made. With an irresistible sense that something was wrong, I descended the notched path with haste. What is the matter? Signalman killed this morning, sir. Not the man I know. You will recognize him, sir, if you knew him, said the man who spoke for the others, solemnly uncovering his own head and raising an end of the tarpaulin, covering a lump on the ground. Oh, how did this happen? He was cut down by an engine, sir. He'd struck the light and had the lamp in his hand. His back was towards the engine as he came out of the tunnel, and she cut him down. That man there drove her, and was showing how it happened. Show the gentleman, Tom. The man, who wore a rough, dark uniform, stepped back to his former place at the mouth of the tunnel. Coming round the curve in the tunnel, sir, he said. I saw him at the end. There was no time to check speed, as he didn't take heed of the whistle. I shut it off when we were running down upon him, and called to him as loud as I could call. What did you say? I said, Below there! Look out! Look out! For God's sake, clear the way! I put this arm before my eyes, not to see, and I waved this arm to the last. But it was no use. Alfred Hitchcock once said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "It's terribly rude not to believe in ghosts. After all, they believe in you." Show the ghosts in your home how much you believe in them by giving this podcast a 5-star rating. Last year, Amy and I were down here for Christmas. Those of you who were here then will remember how very warm it was at this time last year. We played croquet that day on the lawn. It was perhaps a little too cold for croquet, but we played it in order to be able to say that we had done so. It was certainly as warm on the lawn then as it was in the billiard room this morning directly after breakfast. While today I should not wonder if there was 3 feet of snow outside. More, probably. Listen. We had no frost that autumn, and one of the dahlias was still in flower. I've always thought that it must have been mad, and I wonder if I were not mad, too. While the rest of you played your half game of croquet, it struck me that it was not so warm as I had supposed, because quite suddenly I shivered, and shivering, I looked up, but I did not see anyone playing croquet at all. I saw something which had no relation to you. At least I hope not. You all know the croquet lawn, and how it is bounded all round by a flower border, with a brick wall behind it, through which there's only one gate. Well, I looked up and saw that the lawn was shrinking, and the walls closing in upon it. The rays of the sun began to fade, till it grew quite dark overhead, and only a glimmer of light came in through the gate. There was, as I told you, a dahlia in flower that day, and as this dreadful darkness and bewilderment came over me, I remember that my eyes sought it in a kind of despair, holding on to any familiar object. But it was no longer a dahlia, for at that moment the hallucination was complete. I was no longer sitting on the lawn watching croquet. Rather, I was passing through a dark enclosure of fog, or black mist. As the mist cleared, I saw that, where there had been that unseasonable dahlia, there now burned the last dim rays of dusk, and my eyes were drawn there into what I soon discovered was a graveyard. Row upon row, the tombstones glimmered faintly in the dusk, and at the far end of it, only just visible in the gathering darkness, were the roofs and small spire of a cemetery chapel. The gate was opened, and I entered, walking upon a gravel path in the direction of the chapel. The tombstones came to an end at a broad space of open grass between me and the chapel. There stood a single, solitary grave. I left the path and went to it, though it appeared rather new, glimmering with a pale sheen in the dusk. I saw that already moss and lichen had covered the face of it. I wondered whether it was the grave of some stranger who had died a lonely death, and had no friend or relation to look after it. The name, whatever it was overgrown. With some impulse of pity for this forgotten soul, I began scraping at it with my fingernails. The moss peeled off quite easily, coming away in long shreds and fibers, and presently I saw that the name was visible. As I worked, the darkness had so gathered that I could not read it. All this, I suppose, took place with the instantaneousness of a dream, for at once the whole thing had vanished, and I was back on the lawn again, dripping with perspiration and trembling all over. Now all of you may say I had fallen asleep, and had a sudden nightmare. That may be so. Shall I go on? Well, let us say for the moment that it was not a dream exactly, but a hallucination. Whichever it was, it haunted me for months. It was never quite out of my mind, but lingered somewhere in the dusk of consciousness. And as the weeks went on, the seed began to sprout that I had been daydreaming. I can't say that it actually affected my health. I did not sleep or eat insufficiently, but still I always found myself deep in some abyss of despair. I told my wife, who laughed at me, and my doctor, who laughed also, and assured me that my health was quite robust. At the time, he suggested that change of air and scene does wonders for the delusions and fancies of the imagination. And so I took a holiday in Scotland to do some hunting up in a small forest in Sutherland, very remote and wild, and not far from the sea. Sudden sea mists were common. One day my guide and I stalked a deer to a very high tableland on the limit of the forest, which went down very steeply on one side to a loch that lay below it, and gently sloping on the other to a river which ran from the loch down to my lodge. We had a dreadful climb over big boulders with deep holes between, masked by clumps of heather. We had to watch our step to avoid broken bones. The deer we'd been stalking must have smelled us out, in spite of our precautions against the wind, for it was nowhere to be seen. We ate lunch on the heather and enjoyed a well-earned smoke in the sunlight. The morning had been extraordinarily warm, with a little wind blowing off the sea. I felt an extreme sense of peace. Never since Christmas had I been so free of fear. But then my guide urged that we must move on. The weather had changed, he said. We should be off this high ground as soon as possible, he said. A sea mist would presently come up, and the crags we'd just negotiated would be a bad place to get down in a heavy mist. Fearing the mist, which was already boiling up from the sea, I felt in my pocket for the compass, but there was none to be found. We were not yet halfway down when the mist overtook us, shooting up from the valley like the broken water of a wave. In 3 minutes' time, we were enveloped in a fog so thick we could barely see a dozen yards ahead. We were happy that we'd taken the gentle slope towards the river instead of maneuvering once again over the crags. But the mist grew thicker, and I got wetter in the next hour than I have ever been before or since. The wet seemed to penetrate the skin and chill our bones. And still there was no sign of the track for which I was making. Fear began to overtake me, and it was getting dark and had grown very much colder. Soon we found ourselves walking through a steady fall of snow. I heard the distant brawling of the river, which comforted me for a time. But before I had gone 100 yards in the direction of the river, I heard a sudden choked cry from behind me and saw my guide's form flying as if in terror of pursuit into the mists. I called out but got no reply. The darkness enveloped me and seemed to shield me from the snow. Then the sky suddenly grew lighter, revealing the moon, which lighted everything around me. But it was not the moon. It was the faint orange rays of dusk illuminating my path. The light smoldered with the madness of a dahlia blooming out of season, a dahlia unaware that its time has passed. The whole of my months-long terror came back to me, for I saw that the vision in the garden was again fulfilled, and once more I found myself striding into that same graveyard I'd seen on that warm Christmas. There stood the chapel with its queer little spire. There was the new gravestone covered with lichen, except now the caul of lichen was furrowed, as if partially scraped off by a man's fingernails. My fingernails. Again I saw that the name was visible, but as I worked, the darkness had gathered that I could not read it, just as before. I lit a match and held it to the surface of the stone, and the name I read there was my own. At that moment I saw stealing towards me a tall, gaunt figure as of a man, but well over 6 feet in height, with grotesquely elongated limbs, and my soul was sick unto death. I think I tried to scream, but I could not. I know that I tried to move and could not. And it crept closer. I do not know how I found my way back to the lodge. I only know that I did. Next day I developed a chill. And as you know, pneumonia laid me on my back for 6 weeks. Well, that is my story, and there are hundreds of ways in which you can explain it. Is that all, you ask? Yes. It was nearly too much for me. Stick around after the credits for a brief word from some of our fellow indie podcasters, creators, and friends. There may even be some bloopers, outtakes, and bonus content as well. You have been listening to Octoberpod. Octoberpod is produced, edited, and directed by Edward October. The series co-producers are M.J. McAdams and Amber Jordan. Logo and banner graphics by Jessica Good. Edward October character design by Nick Calavera. Select still photography courtesy of unsplash.com. Select music cues by Dr. Dreamchip and various other stock music and sound effects courtesy of freesound.org. Music from Bigfoot Apocalypse and Thorax, theme from Octoberpod, composed by Nico Vitesi. All other images, music, and FX cues, except where noted, are sourced from within the public domain. Follow us on YouTube at Octoberpod Home Video, on Instagram, and the app I still call Twitter at Octoberpod VHS, and on TikTok and Blue Sky at Octoberpod. Or find us and all of our links on the World Wide Web at Octoberpodvhs.com. For business inquiries or story submissions, email octoberpod@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this program, we'd be very pleased if you told your friends about us. And while you're at it, write us a 5-star or equivalent review wherever you're listening. The man who spoke to you was Mr. Edward October.
Hello, twisted humans. Do you find yourself wanting to know more about the latest murder, conspiracy, cult, or haunting? Then this is the podcast for you. In 1952, there was a record high of UFOs reported. 1,500 sightings. There has been evidence of human sacrifice, devil worship, and it is haunted by more spirits than can be counted. A family of 2 adults and 2 kids reportedly saw a giant flying thing with glowing red eyes. And meanwhile, the family's nanny that helped Veronica to care for her and Lucian's children was found bludgeoned to death in the basement of their family home. I'm Alicia. And I'm Sierra, and this is Twisted and Uncorked.
Listen up, true crime fans. I have a podcast that you won't want to miss. A heartfelt show that focuses on lesser-known crimes from around the globe called Our True Crime Podcast.
All right, buckle up, I guess. We gotta put our
ready?
seatbelts on. We gotta go.
Every week, hosts Jen and Cam will guide you through a new case backed up by meticulous research and delivered with the utmost respect for victims and survivors. Cases like the fatal exorcism of Joan Vollmer.
Yes, eyes can turn red and appear to glow from increased adrenaline and blood flow.
I did not know that.
And the Haynes family massacre.
I'm almost afraid to hear it.
As a parent, I don't even know. I don't know.
You'll not only learn about the cases, you'll feel like you're part of a conversation with witty, lifelong friends. That's what truly makes this our true crime podcast. So whether you're a true crime aficionado,
I thought you might say that. I was hoping anyway.
Or a casual listener,
That's a baseball team, Jen, if you didn't know.
Oh, I figured it was some kind of sports ball thing.
sit down and join us for our true crime podcast. Listen on your favorite podcast apps today.
It's a Sunday. I'm sitting in a dark, dark room talking to my best buddy about
crime.
That's right.
¡Bienvenidos a la cripta!
Hola, amor.
Hola, cariño.
Y bienvenidos a Uy, qué horror, a Latinx horror movie podcast with Johnny
And Eileen. En este espeluznante podcast, we explore the often overlooked world of Latinx horror films. Cada semana, we watch and discuss horror films from different countries in Latin America,
or with a Latinx director,
or starring a Latinx lead.
Si es de horror y Latinx, we're watching it.
Nuevos episodios every Monday.
Listen to Uy, qué horror on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Struggling grunts.
Give it.
Hey, yippee!
Come on.
Hooray! That's the spirit. All right, now we're talking.
Some late-breaking news. The Calaveras County Sheriff's Office has confirmed that a series of break-ins are occurring throughout the county. All of these, we are told, are somehow linked to a recent break-in at the Calaveras County Morgue, We've now received reports of violence associated with these incidents. Details are still sketchy in this evolving situation. Calaveras County Sheriff Jennifer Cameron is urging everyone to stay in their homes as the situation unfolds. I'm Edward October, and I can't think of a better idea than staying indoors. You may hear the wind picking up outside, and perhaps your car is beginning to disappear under a skiff of new snowfall. We've got the soundtrack to keep you in a cozy holiday mood. Keep it right here.